And we think back to how it started and when it started. That's the official start date. But the movement started some 40 years prior to that, in the even early 1800s. I want us to just think today, though, when we think about how things start, and I think of some churches I know that have opened in this country. Maybe you think of a church that you've been around that you see opened in the United States, or you think of ministries that have started. And when they start, often we like to start these days, we like to start with a bang. We like to start with a splash. It's just kind of how we like to do it. I remember I was over at a church in America last year, probably one of the biggest and most impressive churches I've seen. And, you know, they were quite, I don't know what the word would be. They were quite happy to let me know how much the building cost, and they were quite happy to let me know how it all been paid for already, quite happy to show me around and the key card access and all the rooms and the storage and the TVs and the sound system and the broadcast room. It was very, very, very impressive. And I must admit, I was extremely impressed with the facilities and everything that they were doing for the gospel from that building. And I was impressed. And it's common. This is kind of how we do things today. But when I go back to, when I contemplate sometimes how our movement started, it wasn't quite as impressive, so to speak. And it had much more humble and much more smaller origins. When I think about Adventism, when I think about the very, very start, there were certain things that the movement united around. And as we look at go to our subject this evening, I want to look at kind of what was the uniqueness of Adventism from the very start. When we think back to the 1840s, the 1850s, and the 1860s, what made Adventism unique? And I say Adventism in a broad sense of the word. William Miller is someone that we well know. We know his place in our history. He was a Baptist farmer, and he was someone who studied his Bible after the War of 1812. He went back to his home and he studied Birthplace of Adventism in America. And while he studied his Bible, he came across a verse that he couldn't quite understand. His home is up there in New York State. If you have a chance to visit it, it's a great place to go and just kind of see the surroundings and see one of the places key to our history. And there in his bedroom, he studied with his Bible and his concordance until he came to Daniel 8:14. And when he came to these verses in the book of Daniel, he didn't quite understand what they meant. This was around the year 1818, 1819. And as he studies this verse and he tries to flesh it out, he comes to the conclusion that Jesus is going to come in about 25 years. He studies it out again for another 3 or 4 years just to make sure his conclusions are fully accurate. But then he actually does nothing with the conclusions that he comes to. He shares it with a few family members. He writes a few articles in a local paper, but he doesn't actually do anything and preach it and share the message with anyone. You may be familiar with the story about how he actually came to preach. It was when his nephew came by his house and asked if he would preach and share the messages with the group that they had because the preacher was away. Now, he about 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes before his nephew knocked on the door, he himself had laid a fleece out to God that he thought would not be fulfilled. It was a fleece where he said, if I get an invitation to preach, I'll preach. Now, he thought that was a pretty safe fleece because over the past 12 or 13 years, he had never been invited to preach anywhere. So he's now asking God to do something that has not happened over the past 10 years, but in however many minutes, I don't remember exactly how many it was, but it was a short time, maybe 15 minutes later, the knock on his door comes and his nephew asks him to come and share the messages that he has been studying with the group there. He's very upset. He leaves the house, and the reason he's upset is because he knows the nephew left his house before he actually knelt down to pray, because the distance from his house to his was more than the time gap from when he prayed until when he opened the door. And he knows beyond the shadow of a doubt that God has called him to preach, and God has answered the prayer that he made. And the Maple Grove, there's that sign you can see on the screen where it says, he went in a farmer, he came out a preacher. And over the next 13 or 14 years leading up to 1844, William Miller preaches the soon return of Jesus. The movement grows, and it's not, William Miller's the most famous one, but there was other people, Edward Irving, who preached the soon return of Jesus in England. There was other people in South America and Asia and Africa who were preaching the soon return of Jesus. And the movement gets a boost in 1840 with the fulfillment of the prophecy of Revelation chapter 9 with Josiah Litch, and as he pinpointed when the Ottoman Empire would fall, and the movement gets a boost. And the next 3 or 4 years, there's a great crescendo of people joining this movement. Baptisms are happening. It's not a new denomination. There's people getting baptized in the Baptist church and the Methodist church across the board, as people are looking forward to the return of Jesus. And they're expecting Jesus to come initially in the spring of 1844. And when that doesn't happen, there's kind of a mini disappointment, and there's a shaking of the movement. And then they reassess when he's coming, and they say it's going to be in the autumn, and then eventually they pinpoint a date, and it leads up to this date of October the 22nd, when people are waiting for Jesus to come on that day. And it's hard for us to imagine. We are an Advent movement, and we do believe in the return of Jesus. And to have that similar belief that Jesus is coming is a precious thing. I know when I've been to general conference sessions in the past, when they've had the big sessions, and it's been something special to be there on the Sabbath morning of the first or the second weekend, and you're there in the indoor stadium with the roof closed, and there's 50 or 60 or 70,000 Adventists, and they come to the final song, and everyone is singing, "We have this hope." And there's just something powerful about singing that song about the second coming with 50,000+ people that all have the same belief in Jesus' soon return. But imagine if you times that number, not 50,000, but 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, maybe, I'm not sure exactly, 400,000 people. They're waiting for the return of Jesus, but not just this, I believe he's going to come within the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, or sometime in the future. But you've got a group of 300,000-400,000 people that believe he's coming on a set day. And the fervor was great. And it leads to a fever pitch, almost, so to speak. And then on October the 22nd, 1844, the believers wait. They wait. The believers in Lowhampton, where William Miller was from, they gathered on this rock, and they wait there all day, and they wait there all night. And Jesus does not come, and a disappointment comes over the group. And I've often, before, I used to preach that the movement was 200 or 300,000 people, and then it shrank overnight to just 50 people. Now, I look back on sometimes the times when I've mentioned that and realize that I was actually drastically wrong in what I said, because after October 22nd, 1844, the movement didn't just drop off immediately. What happened over the next 1 year or year and a half is a slow fragmenting of Millerite Adventism. And it's interesting to notice the fragmentations that took place over a very short period of time, and how which line of these fragmentations the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers that we look back on actually came from. So right after 1844, Millerite Adventism split into kind of two camps that historians have looked at. One of them was what we call mainline Adventists, and the other one was called Bridegroom Adventists. Mainline Adventists would have been people like Joshua V. Himes and William Miller. They were mainline. Bridegroom Adventists would have been people like Ellen White, Joseph Bates. Now, if we're to look at percentages, roughly about 75% of the Millerite Adventists after October 22nd, 1844 would have been mainline. And Bridegroom Adventists would have been about 25%. Now, Ellen White and Joseph Bates were some of the principal founders of our church, and they come from the line of Bridegroom Adventists. But what's the difference between these two groups of people? When mainline Adventists abandoned the belief that October the 22nd was a prophetic date, and they started to look for new dates. However, Bridegroom Adventists, mainline Adventists, some of them, the ones that come from there is the Advent Christian Church, of which there are today about 25,000 people. And I believe a later split from them was the JWs. Now, the Bridegroom Adventists, they maintained that October 22nd was a prophetic date. They believed it was accurate. They believed the date was true. So if you could summarize it down into two things, the mainline Adventists believed that they had the wrong date, but the right event. So the event of Jesus' return, but we had the wrong date. Whereas the Bridegroom Adventist said we had the wrong date. Sorry, we have the right date, but the wrong event. The date was right. October 22nd, 1844 was correct, but we must have got the event wrong. Whereas mainline said we got the wrong date, but right event. Now, there was a further split that happened, and we're talking about like periods of months or weeks between these splits. The Bridegroom Adventists of 25%. There was another split between the spiritualizers, 90%, and the literalists, about 10%. I mean, it kind of is self-explanatory what they are. The spiritualizers and the literalists, the spiritualizers had abandoned their views by the end of 1845, whereas the literalists would have been the Whites and the Bates, only 10% of the 25%. And the literalists believed that, in a literal application of what they had studied, that Jesus, those things were literal. The spiritualized as well. Jesus, his coming is going to be spiritual, or he's going to come into your heart, or they spiritualize it. And this is around about 6 months after October 22nd, 1844. They believed that Jesus had come, but it was a spiritual return. Whereas the literalists believe in a literal interpretation of the events that they preached about. And so there's this fragmentation, so to speak. There are these splits in the movement. As God is refining, he's shaking out the early Adventist believers. And at this point, they're sea captains, they're James and Ella White, they're young people in their early 20s. It's a very varied group of people in early Adventism. So we got mainline 75, we got Bridegroom 25, we got spiritualizers 90, we've got literalists 10, and then there's a further split amongst the literalists. There's the split between the one-day view, which is they literally believe that the judgment happened on one day. And then there's the extended view. Now, the one-day view, some of those people were Samuel Snow. Extended view, again, O.R.L. Crozier, Hiram Edson, and the Whites had this extended view. What's the difference, or what's the belief? And this is by about 1846. So from the end of 1844 up until 1846, you've had a split from mainline to Bridegroom. You've had a split from spiritualizers to literalists. You've had a split from one-day view to extended view. All of this is happening within the movement. Now, people outside the movement, they may not have known these differences. Kind of like today when someone's outside of Adventism, they don't really know the differences that we have within ourselves between progressives and liberals and conservatives and traditionals and ultra conservative. They don't really know those differences. Even within certain pockets of Adventism, we may say, oh, they're all this way, but within that group, they've got all these different types of factions that only those within the group actually know about all those different types of factions that are going on. And it was probably something like this, that outside of Adventism, they're just Adventists, but inside you've got all of these shakings and movement taking place. And now you've got a one-day view and you've got an extended view. The extended view is the belief that the judgment began on October the 22nd, 1844, and extends all the way up until close to the second coming. So here you've got it on the screen again, mainline, bridegroom, spiritualizers, literalists, one day and extended view. And when you look down that line, that train that you have there on the right-hand side of the screen, that's the line of where our pioneers that would eventually kind of come together and form the real birth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Whites and the Bates and Edson and so on. They came down through that line. And notice how it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Over a period of 2 years, this movement that had grown to be so big just gets shaken, 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 sifted, 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 sifted. It's almost like Gideon when he had his soldiers. He had so many of his soldiers that were gathered and ready to fight the enemy. And God's like, no, I'm going to sift it once. I'm going to sift it again. There, you're just going to have your 300 to go and fight the enemy. The origins of our church are very humble. And it reminds me of some of these texts I'm reminded of in the Old Testament, 2 Chronicles 16:9, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is perfect toward him. God's looking for a people, not the biggest, not the best, not the brightest, not the smartest necessarily, but people whose heart is perfect towards him, on whose behalf he can show his strength. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9 says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And I like this next text as well, for it says, the Lord did not set his love on you or choose you because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all people. It's not because of how great you are that God set his love on you, because actually you were the smallest. And when I think about the origins of the Adventist church, we come from such humble origins numerically. And also when you look at who was the early founders of our church, they weren't these trained theologians or whoever. They were just people that had committed to study their Bibles, people that committed to say, God, use me to the best of my ability and fill me with your spirit that I can take the message to the world around me. 1844 to 1846 is this time period of shaking as this doctrine and teaching of the sanctuary is slowly sifted out amongst the believers, and they come to this kind of view that the view that they had on October the 22nd, 1844 is not the same view we hold today. They had the right date, but they had the wrong event, and it took them 2-3 years or so to kind of sift through the Bible and figure out what it said, and finally come to this settled understanding that, the judgment began. It wasn't the earth being cleansed by fire. It's Jesus moving compartments from one part of the sanctuary in heaven to another part, and it's going to begin now but continue all the way up to the second coming. And as this doctrine is being refined through Bible study, God is leading and guiding his people. What makes us unique? What's our identity? What's the fingerprint of Adventism on our movement? And the sanctuary message holds a key part in that, because it was this understanding of Daniel 8:14. That's part of the little book that's sealed in Revelation chapter 10 that was then opened. It's a key part of our identity, and it wasn't just what led up to 1844 where this message was understood, but it's in the 1, 2, 3 years after 1844 where it really starts to be unpacked in the midst of grief and disappointment to understand what God's word said to them and what it really and truly meant. What makes us different? What makes us unique? Another key feature of Adventism is the Sabbath, because it's right there in our name. We're not actually called. There's nothing about the sanctuary in our name, though I know it's a very key teaching and doctrine. Ellen White affirms that. She tells us several times that it's a hallmark of our faith. But in our name is the word Seventh-day Adventists. the Sabbath is something that is key. But up in 1846, 1845, the Sabbath is not really playing a role in the movement. Millerite Adventism is not focused on the Sabbath. Millerite Adventism is focused on the sanctuary. But creeping in around 1846 or so, you've got this teaching of the Sabbath that starts to creep in. This man here called T.M. Preble, he writes a tract, and his tract has an impact on our movement. His tract was a tract showing that the seventh day should be observed as the Sabbath instead of the first day according to the commandment. They didn't really go for short titles back then. T.M. Preble, his tract was the tract that convinced Joseph Bates to keep the Sabbath. His tract was also the tract that convinced J. N. Andrews and the young people in Paris Hill, Maine, to keep the Sabbath. So his tract was pretty powerful. It had a big impact on two of the key pioneers in our church, Joseph Bates and J. N. Andrews. It's interesting, an interesting fact of Adventist history, I think, is that T.M. Preble himself only kept the Sabbath for 3.5 years. Only keeps it for 3.5 years. After 3.5 years, he abandoned Sabbath keeping himself and goes back to whether he went to Sunday or whether he went to nothing, I don't know. But he abandoned Sabbath keeping after 3.5 years. God will use us, but just because he's used us for something monumentous in our life, we have to continue to be in a saving relationship with Jesus. But the impact of his work impacted Joseph Bates and J. N. Andrews, and obviously they impacted thousands more after them. This small church here in Washington, New Hampshire, is the place where Frederick Wheeler was speaking one Sunday, and where he was challenged by a Rachel Preston Oakes, who came by his church and challenged him why he wasn't keeping the Sabbath. She was a Seventh-day Baptist herself, and so you've got this movement in early the late 1800s of different people that are studying the Sabbath. Joseph Bates finds it from T.M. Preble. He finds out that there's a group up there in Washington, New Hampshire, with Frederick Wheeler and Cyrus Farnsworth, and you've got this Sabbath pact. They all come to an agreement between themselves. Ellen White, how does she learn about the Sabbath? And what's the connection? Ellen White finds out about the Sabbath from a tract that Joseph Bates later wrote. Rachel Preston Oakes is the one who convinced Frederick Wheeler. And so you've got these cross relationships between some of these people of the Sabbath sprouting up and becoming an interesting teaching there. This is the house of Cyrus Farnsworth. It's just a house that I own by someone who's probably wonders why random Adventists come and take pictures of his house. This is the tract that Joseph Bates writes, the seventh-day Sabbath, a perpetual sign from the beginning to the entering into the gates of the holy city, according to the commandment by Joseph Bates. Again, another tract with a very, very long name. Joseph Bates writes this tract, the seventh-day Sabbath, a perpetual sign, and he's the first one who actually used these two verses in the Bible, Revelation 11, verse 19, and Revelation 14, verse 12. Joseph Bates is the first person who connects the doctrine of the Sabbath with the sanctuary. And you ask, what is the uniqueness of Adventism? He's the first one who connects the Sabbath with the sanctuary. The sanctuary at this point has kind of been refined down to pretty much what we believe on it today. He's the first one, though, that connects this new teaching of the Sabbath that's coming up within Millerite Adventism and connects it to the Sabbath. In Revelation 11, verse 19, he sees you've got the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place in the sanctuary. And he obviously follows the reason. You've got the Ark of the Covenant. Inside the Ark of the Covenant is the Ten Commandments. Inside the Ten Commandments is the Sabbath. So he shows how the Sabbath is there in the most holy place in the Ark of the Covenant. And he's the first one that connects these two doctrines in January of 1847. In January of 1847. And so you have this coming together of some of the key players. Notice here, I added something here. on this screen. You've got January 1847 is when he writes this tract. In March of 1847 is when Ellen White has her Sabbath halo vision. And in November of the previous year is when Ellen White has a vision called the opening of the heavens vision. And you wonder, why is that even playing a role in this discussion? It's almost like a side thing, but it's interesting to note that Joseph Bates at that point wasn't convinced of the prophetic gift of Ellen White. She was only 19 at this time, and he's not convinced that she is a prophet. And Joseph Bates was an amateur astronomer. And God gave Ellen White a vision in November of 1846, where she saw the stars and she saw the solar system and she saw things, and she had knowledge on subjects way beyond her education. And Joseph Bates saw that vision and saw what God gave her as a vision, and believed that this must have been from God, and it must be a vision from God, because she did not have access and she did not know these things. And so it was actually that vision in November of 1846 that convinced Joseph Bates that Ellen White was a prophet. And at that point, you have a coming together between the three principal founders of Adventism, Joseph Bates, Ellen White, and James White, kind of coming together. Some historians believe that God gave Ellen White that vision just for the purpose of convincing Joseph Bates and bringing our principal founders together. After he writes that tract, Ellen White has a vision a couple of months later. And it's interesting that the vision that Ellen White has is after the tract is written by about 3 months. Ellen White herself was convinced to keep the Sabbath based on the writing of Joseph Bates, which was Bible text that he had put together. What is the uniqueness of Adventism? What is it that brings our people together? And what it was at the beginning? We have the sanctuary message filtered down and all these fragmentations, and we have the Sabbath message coming up with T.M. Preble, Joseph Bates, Jane Andrews, and Ellen White accepting it. And then we have this coming together between these two various doctrines. From 1844, 1845, 1846, you've got this scattering and you've got this fragmentation of the early Advent believers as they disagree on their beliefs on the sanctuary. In 1847, 1848, you've got this gathering together time where the truth or the doctrine or the teaching that God chose to reunite and bring his believers back together around is the Sabbath. They gathered together, and it was in 1848 where there were 6 Sabbath conferences across New England and New York State. And these conferences that were just there just to study the Sabbath, and the believers gather again together around this teaching, around this doctrine of the Sabbath. What is the uniqueness of Adventism? It's not the sanctuary and it's not the Sabbath, but it's the sanctuary and the Sabbath combined together. It's a sanctuary and a Sabbath, this rest of the Sabbath and the test that the Sabbath has, combined with the sanctuary together. It's understanding the Sabbath in the context of the sanctuary, is understanding that the Sabbath is not just a rest for us today. Sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, I just love the Sabbath. It's just this 24 hours. It's a holy 24-hour period," and that is true. And it's just this time where we just rest and we just rest, and and a lot of emphasis is put onto the rest of the Sabbath and the fact that it's just this time for us to just de-stress. It's a time for us to do all these. Do less and so on. But the Sabbath is a rest. But the Sabbath, we know, with the context of the sanctuary and understanding what's happening at the end of time, the Sabbath is also going to be a test. It's going to be a test of our faith. And our understanding of the Sabbath is vastly different from the Seventh-day Baptist understanding of the Sabbath, is vastly different from the Jewish understanding of the Sabbath. As deep and meaningful as some Jews have an understanding of the Sabbath. And if you've ever been to Israel and you've seen the joy when they bring in the Sabbath at the Western Wall on a Friday evening, it's fascinating to watch, but it still falls short of the understanding that the Bible puts on the Sabbath of it's not just a day of worship now, but it's a test on our faith that's going to happen at the end of time. The Sabbath, in the context of the sanctuary, gives us that understanding as to where we are headed. When we look back and we see the early, mid, and late 1800s, we see the formulation of this teaching of the doctrine, and we see the birth of the Sabbath, but the Sabbath in the context and understood through the lens of the sanctuary. This, I believe, is one of the key uniqueness of the Adventist church, understanding the Sabbath in the context of the sanctuary. Our doctrines and our beliefs were all come to and settled through Bible study. It was through careful Bible study that our pioneers came to this understanding and came to the knowledge of the teachings as each one was discovered. The Sabbath was not given to Ellen White by vision. The Sabbath was given through Bible study. Joseph Bates, T.M. Preble, these men studied out the Sabbath, and later on it was reinforced through vision or confirmed through visions that Ellen White may have had. And it's in the Sabbath that you really see that clearly the most. The early Advent believers had a debate as to when they should keep the Sabbath. Some said we should keep it from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Other people said we should keep it from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. And there was this debate or contention between p.m. to p.m. or a.m. to a.m. And most people did 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. on Sabbath, but they weren't really sure. And it's interesting, should we keep it from morning to morning or evening to evening? And from 1847 to 1855, the early Advent believers kept the Sabbath from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Ellen White was given a vision in 1847 about the Sabbath, and she was told to keep it from even to even. And they interpreted that as being 6 p.m. to 6 p.m., even though that's a wrong interpretation, so to speak. God still left them. But in 1855, the believers studied it out again, and Jay and Andrews studied out the Sabbath, and he came by with 6 reasons as to when the Sabbath should be kept. And his arguments were as follows: that the Sabbath should be kept from sunset to sunset, because a day begins at night, a day could not begin at sunrise, evening meant sunset, dividing hours was a heathen custom, and there was no watches before 1658. And he puts all these arguments together, and the believers vote on when they should keep the Sabbath. And it's interesting in 1855 then that when they vote on when they should keep the Sabbath, everyone votes to keep the Sabbath from sunset to sunset except Ellen White and Joseph Bates. And it's like, whoa, why did those two miss out? Well, they thought that the understanding they had 5, 7, or 8 years ago was correct, and they should still stick to 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. But God gives Ellen White a correcting vision 3 days later, and you wonder why the wait. When we keep the Sabbath is far too important an issue to be settled by vision. It must be done through Bible study. It was through a careful Bible study that the believers settled on sunset to sunset. Just as I came on this call before we officially started prayer meeting, I heard one of the members talking about giving Bible studies to someone. And if you're giving Bible studies to someone and they're asking, why do you keep the Sabbath? And you say, because it's in the Bible. And when do we keep the Sabbath? Well, from sunset to sunset. Well, why do you keep it from sunset to sunset? Oh, well, we keep it from sunset to sunset because a prophet had a vision. Doesn't really hold much weight. We keep it from sunset to sunset because the Bible says so. And let me show you here in Leviticus, and let me show you here in Mark. And you take them to the text, and you can show clearly that what we believe is founded on the Bible. And when you look at the role that Ellen White played early on, it's interesting to see how it interacts with the doctrines that were formed. God is more concerned we believe the right thing for the right reason, though we may be wrong for a time, than we believe the right thing for the wrong reason. And you see that throughout early Adventism again and again and again. God was concerned that we would have to believe the right thing for the right reason. And he's more concerned with the process of understanding. And when we look at early Adventism, it's encouraging to see how God led our church through the scattering of 1844, 5, and 6, the gathering of 1846, 47, 48, and how we settled on the understanding of who we are. It's powerful to see the fingerprint of Adventism in those early years and how God has given us a unique message of the Sabbath in the context of the sanctuary. I pray that God may bless us and that we would understand our uniqueness and that we may understand the place and the role we play and understand that the Sabbath teaching that we have today and the beauty that we have, it's great for the rest, but there's a test that's coming, and may we be faithful for the testing times that come ahead for us.